Hi everyone! Inflation is the number one priority in most countries that wish to see a sound economy. The reason for this is that if inflation left unchecked, it makes things more expensive for the domestic population, damages companies through increased costs, and weakens the currency which is needed to buy things from abroad. If left, the only corrective methods available to central bankers or governments are punitive rises in interest rates and reductions in money supply or rises in taxation, all of which will cause pain to the electorate. So why is Turkey, a major country of some 83 million people, doing the exact opposite in the face of runaway inflation? What's going on and why? In this video, we'll try and find out. I'm Anthony, and as always, we're talking money. Read any newspapers that cover this subject, and Turkey stands out in the face of combating inflation. In the UK and US and most other Western countries, the spectre of inflation, whether you think it's temporary or ingrained, is seen as a top priority, as I said. Keeping inflation to a relatively low arbitrary figure of about 2% is a long-term goal of central bankers. So much so that both the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England are adopting the now well-trodden path of monetary tightening to attempt to bring down inflation rates that are currently above this long-term goal. Turkey, on the other hand, is doing the exact opposite. Milton Friedman theorised that inflation was a monetary phenomenon, and to combat it required monetary policies of increasing interest rates and reducing the money supply in the system. Turkey has inflation running hot currently, around about 25%, and has just reduced its interest rates again from 19% to 14%. The currency is devaluing and in turn stoking inflation rates even higher. A huge amount of damage is being done to companies and the people in the country. So why is President Erdogan pursuing this policy? Is he mad, or is there a method to the madness? After all, controls on inflation can have a detrimental effect elsewhere on the economy, so careful tinkering is often the best policy rather than large swings. One possible answer may lie with the experience that China went through in the late 1970s and early 1980s. China at the time, under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, underwent an economic change to what was called a socialist market economy. Part of the strategy was to devalue the currency from 1.5 yuan to the dollar to about 2.8 yuan to the dollar in 1981. With a weaker currency, exporters were more able to sell their products abroad, but more on this later. In Turkey, President Erdogan, has said that cutting rates will eventually bring down inflation and raise investment, employment and exports, enhancing Turkey's independence from other countries. However, even though this seems counterintuitive, his focus is exports. On one hand, he has a point. A weaker currency makes export products seem cheaper to overseas buyers, and a devalued currency will usually succeed in boosting the country's exporting industries. What else could support Erdogan's theory? Well, Turkey is a pretty major economy, in the top 20 if measured by nominal GDP, and seen as a significant emerging economy, and like most emerging economies, they are somewhat dependent on the central bank policies of much larger economies, not least the policies of the Federal Reserve. Why? Well, because emerging economies are largely dependent on their exchange rates, especially against the dollar. Capital will either flow into or out of an emerging economy, either based on the strength of their own economy, but more likely the strength or weakness of the American economy and the policies that come out of the Federal Reserve. A higher American interest rate, for example, will lead to flows of capital out of emerging economies and into the US, as the return of holding dollars goes up with higher US interest rates. Anyway, the reverse happens when the US interest rates go down. Flows of capital go away from the US and find a home in riskier currencies, one of which could be the Turkish lira. After all, you can get 14% interest rates in Turkey at the moment and about 1% in the US. After years of capital inflows, in part due to higher interest rates, rate cuts in Turkey now and the prospect of rate rises in the US now see the opposite, and capital flows away from Turkey. Previous flows of capital into Turkey kept the currency strong, and had it continued could support a reductionist policy in interest rates. The policy would work even better if imports form a minor part of the economy. Net exporting economies can weather a weaker exchange rate because inflation is not imported by the back door with higher import prices. This was especially the case with China in Deng Xiaoping's era of economic reform. They focused on exports, weakened the currency to support this, and capital flowed into the country as the state opened up the economy to foreign investment by developing industrial or investment zones that were largely free of state bureaucracy. Unfortunately, Turkey doesn't have any of these things. They're not in place on a macro or micro level. Turkey has persistently run a trade deficit and so is vulnerable to imported inflation. Also, inflation has been fueled by the increased money supply via the availability of state-subsidised loans to domestic companies, and more recently, the rise in interest rates that fuel money supply into the economy. But on the plus side, exports have indeed been boosted to the point that Turkey is now a net exporter. But at what cost? Perhaps one of the biggest costs is the credibility of Turkey's economic management, insomuch that even though lower interest rates should make government and corporate borrowing cheaper, the opposite has actually happened as foreign investors seek greater compensation in holding government and corporate debt. Have a look at this graph from the FT that shows the cost of borrowing even though the direction of travel of interest rates has been downwards. This is on top of the dire consequences to the local economy and population. Inflation is now running at over 3% a month and is set to rise further as further devaluations feed into higher import costs. Lower interest rates no longer relieve pressure on companies. Higher import prices are destroying domestic-focused companies, and 50% increases in minimum wages mitigates any advantage that a devaluation may bring. All in all, the corrective measures that Turkey will eventually have to go through will be, or could be, very hard indeed. Before too long, if they're not in this already, a spiral starts to develop whereby devaluation leads to more inflation that leads to more devaluation and then more inflation, and so on and so on. Countries that have suffered from a lack of economic credibility tend to see painful episodes of very high or even hyperinflation. Is Turkey doomed though? Well, not necessarily. The banking system is currently holding up, not least because the population of Turkey are allowed to open and hold deposits in local banks in foreign currency, and even gold. In fact, about 60% of deposits are held in foreign currencies. Over time, people have swapped their lira to hold US dollars and euros. Swapping the local currency to foreign currency fuels the depreciation of the lira and weakens the economy further, but locals feel safer with the US dollar. To stop this tilt away from the lira, President Erdogan has stepped in and introduced new investment products to halt the slide, and also directly intervened by swapping foreign reserves and buying liras. He has undertaken to compensate savers if their liras depreciate by more than the interest rate, thereby protecting the purchasing power of their savings. Also, the central bank will similarly compensate those that swap their foreign savers back into liras. The slide in the lira was halted on the news, but time will tell if this actually works, with the population who may well have already lost faith in their government's economic competence. If it doesn't work, the scheme will prove extremely costly. Worse still, if the population lose faith in their banking system and demand their foreign reserves out, it's easy to see that a run on a bank could happen and potentially the collapse of the entire banking system. So, what else could Turkey do to get out of the current predicament? In short, nothing that wouldn't be painful in the short term. While there's nothing wrong in pursuing an export policy, it's probably best done from a position of strength. To stabilise the situation, credibility needs to be restored. Interest rates probably need to go up, not down, and credit tightened. The amount of capital that banks are required to hold needs to increase, and thereby reducing the amount available to lending. The exchange rate needs to strengthen either by an increase in interest rates or increasing the yield on government bonds, encouraging overseas investors to buy Turkish lira. Wage controls need to be instituted so that wage inflation spirals are limited, and the government needs to rein in spending so that the monthly debt bill can be controlled. Foreign investment into the country needs to be encouraged, but that can only be done if credibility is restored. And finally, capital controls could be hardened that would limit or stop companies or individuals from converting liras to dollars or euros. None of these solutions is very palatable. In fact, some may actually lead to civil unrest, which is the last thing that the country needs. But if things start to stabilise, then a restructuring of the economy along the same lines as China could be sought, but with the proviso that China is a very different kettle of fish, if only because China had, at the time, an almost unlimited labour resource at its disposal. It certainly feels like Turkey is undergoing a bit of an economic experiment at the moment. Who knows how it will eventually turn out? Perhaps the government will change direction, or foreign governments will come to their rescue. Turkey is, after all, an important country. Nobody wants to see more instability on Europe's doorstep. Put your thoughts in the comments section. How does Turkey get out of this predicament? I look forward to reading them. But if you haven't done so already, hit the like button and the subscribe button to the channel if you haven't done so already. It really helps the channel out. I'll catch you in the next video where we're always talking money. And the last thing I need to do is to wish you all a very happy Christmas and New Year. And I'll catch you in the next video. But until then, bye for now.